All right, so I'm going to go through an example of another Renaissance, because in a sense, what Cervantes did was initiate a Renaissance in Spain to bring the ideas of the Italian Renaissance, the revival of Plato and the classical Greek culture, to Spain in the same way that this had been done in Italy, starting with Petrarch and Dante, and also Erasmus was a figure in the Northern European Renaissance. We're going to be talking about a Renaissance that's not that far away from most of your lives, but one that's very little known. Now, I want to make a point at the beginning that I think Madavilia will find quite interesting, because I don't think she was fully aware of this before. But Cervantes played a major role in the Renaissance I'm going to be discussing. But it was largely through Germany and Russia that the people I'm going to be discussing came into familiarity with Cervantes, because Pushkin was a great admirer of Cervantes, the great Russian poet and playwright. And also Heine and a number of German poets were great admirers of Cervantes. Now, a Renaissance is a revival of great classical ideas. That's the best way of looking at what a Renaissance is. The rebirth of the great classical ideas. And the purpose of literature, drama, painting, sculpture, those art forms we associate with the Renaissance, is to transform the notion of man that exists in the time where the artists are engaging in their activity. That is, why do you need a Renaissance? I mean, why do we need a Renaissance today? The conception of man that most people have today, the way Lynn discussed it today, is a degraded conception of man. That we're out for our own pleasures, our own survival, our own security. We need to make money. We've got to have a house. We've got to make sure that we can have pleasure and fun. The popular culture is filled with that kind of conception of what it is to be man. You know, to get your pleasure, to make sure that, you know, maybe you do some good things in your life, but you still take care of number one. Now that's why you need a Renaissance, because if you take that kind of thinking in the population, people who think that way will tolerate the genocide that's occurring in Africa. And we heard very beautiful statements today from two people who are here, in a sense, representing nations, from Uganda and then Crystal from Cameroon, who are here asking, what can I do to save my nation? And that's the mentality of someone who actually takes responsibility for a nation. But how many people do that in this country? What is it? Americans think, well, we've got so many people. Who am I? I'm just one person. Well, in fact, you'll find that movements that transform history start from one person, as in the case of Cervantes, one person who many times realizes that what they do will not be recognized in their time. Or they may get a certain amount of popular acclaim in their time, but it may be centuries later that people actually grasp the implications of what they were doing. As in the case of Cervantes, unfortunately, Spain continued to degenerate. There was not a rebirth in Spain, but Cervantes personally helped create other nations. And one of the figures who is a relatively important figure in the 20th century, who read Cervantes every year in Spanish, was the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who was a product of the Renaissance. You want to know how to spell it? Is that what you're saying, Mike? I had to interpret your gestures there.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah. David Ben-Gurion, who was a product of the movement that I'm going to be discussing in a moment, did two things every year. He read Cervantes in Spanish, and he read Plato in Greek. he studied Greek at the age of 35. So he could learn Greek, so he could read Plato in Greek. So all of you who are under 25, you've got a 10-year head start in learning Greek, Chinese, whatever language you wish to take up. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is something called the Yiddish Renaissance. And it's a little bit different from the great golden Renaissance of the 15th century in Europe. In some ways, and in other ways it was characteristic of that kind of movement. But it's different because it was among people who were not a nation. It's the Jewish people. And part of the fight, which is the fight that, when I told you earlier what Lynn had to say about the Zionist nuts, kick the Zionists in their nuts, that what you have with Zionism, in a sense, is an attempt, an artificial attempt, to create the idea of a nation out of a religion. And that what you'll see from the people I'll be discussing is that their idea of religion was that one could be a patriot of Germany and still a Jew, a Russian national and still a Jew, that you were not a Jew, meaning you were an Israelite. And the fight of the Yiddish Renaissance was to take the Jewish people, who were spread primarily over Poland, Ukraine, Russia, who were poor, who were oppressed, and then who engaged in a self-oppression, to lift them up so they could actually become citizens of nations. Now, I had some personal experience with this growing up in West Virginia. Not one of the more enlightened parts of the world. It was enlightened in the Civil War because it broke from Virginia over the issue of slavery, but it didn't grow since that time. And I went to a school in a poor area in Morgantown, West Virginia. And one time I had my brothers and I used to walk to school with these two guys who lived next door to us, Greasy Powell and his brother Paul Powell. His father actually named him Greasy. And their cousins were Snooky and Odell Goodwin. We were walking home one day, and Greasy Powell said to me, "What nationality are you?" And I said, "I'm an American." This is when I was in 5th grade. And he said, "You're not an American." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "No, you're not. You're Jewish." And I said, "Well, let me explain something." I said, "What religion are you?" And he said, "I'm a Baptist." And I said, "And what nationality are you?" He said, "I'm an American." And I said, "Well, you're a Baptist American, and I'm a Jewish American." And he said, "No, you're not an American because you're Jewish." And to punctuate the point, he jumped me and started hitting me. Fortunately, I had two brothers who jumped to my defense, and we had a nice brawl. And even though it was 4-on-3, we won the fight. And I said, "Now you see, don't mess with Jewish Americans." So who needed the ADL? Now, to get a sense, and I'm going to go through some of this quickly because we have a Fidelio which is devoted solely to the first part of what I'm going to discuss, which is the figure who actually is the most important in creating what became the Yiddish Renaissance, even though, ironically, he did it by attacking Yiddish. Now, Yiddish is what, initially, it was the language of the Jews primarily who migrated from Spain, from North Africa, and from France into Germany and then Eastern Europe. Also from England, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. But before that, they had been along the Rhine in Germany, they'd been in France, and they spoke a number of languages. And it's interesting what Mattavillo was saying about the whole question of Spain having a culture which included Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You know, most people think that the whole time Spain was under Muslim rule, there must have been wars against the Christians and wars against the Jews. But in fact, you had periods of learning and scholarship, and there were great literary works in Arabic. There was also a famous Jewish philosopher who had been in Spain named Maimonides. And Maimonides, who lived in the late 11th, early 12th century, maybe it was the 12th, 13th century, had a very important intervention, because the problem that existed for the Jews was this problem of thinking that since we've been expelled from our homeland, which of course was in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple and drove most of the Jews out, and here you are 12 centuries later, and part of the Jewish service every year is next year in Jerusalem. Not that most people ever expected to go to Jerusalem, but that was just the memory. But with it, there was a sense of constant oppression, of separateness. And so the tradition of Jewish learning was that you sat in these schools, and Phil could tell you a little bit about this. I don't think his was quite as oppressive as most of them, although it may have been. The idea was that the Jewish male should do nothing but study, should be holy, should study the Torah, study the Talmud, which are the commentaries on the Torah. The Torah is what we call today the Old Testament. See, for Jews, there's not an Old Testament and a New Testament. There's just the word from God, the Old Testament, the Torah. But the idea was that to be holy, you have to immerse yourself in this. So you had a split personality in the Jewish community. The men studied Hebrew to read the Torah. But the language of the home was Yiddish, which was a mixture of Hebrew, a little bit of Hebrew. About 70% or more was German. Then some French, some Polish, all sorts of other things thrown in eventually. So it was called a jargon. It wasn't really a language. But it was also known as the Mamaloshen, the mother tongue, because it was the mother in the home who spoke Yiddish, and this was looked down upon by the literary men, these scholars who spent all day studying. But the problem, what that meant is that if you were Jewish, you had one language for prayer, one language for the home, which was Yiddish, but outside of the house, you had to speak whatever language the country you lived in. Now, similarly and ironically, and this was part of what the Renaissance addressed for Christianity, for Christians, you had the language of prayer was Latin. The language of science was Latin, but the common language was, in a sense, a polyglot or a jargon. As we know with Dante, Italian was a language of maybe 1,000 words before Dante and Petrarch and others developed the language. The model language for most of these people was Arabic, because Arabic for Muslims was the language of religion, it was the language of the home, and it was the language of science, with the Arabic Renaissance from the Caliph of Baghdad and the whole tradition of learning that existed long before there were Muslim fundamentalists. But there were also Muslim fundamentalists who rebelled against Arabic culture in the Arabic Renaissance. Now what happened with the Jewish population is that as it was moving around, it clung to this idea of oppression, of using the metaphor of Moses and the escape from Egypt. In a sense, the idea that you just should carry a few things with you. As Sholem Aleichem once said, the one thing a Jew carries with him is a pack of troubles. If bad things are going to come to get you, they'll come down through the chimney. So this idea of being an oppressed people and a separate people and a people without its own language. And this was attacked in Germany by the great Moses Mendelssohn. And we have, maybe if we can turn out the lights so that these transparencies will show up a little bit. Mendelssohn, and again we have a Fidelio that goes through the whole story of Mendelssohn. So I'll just very briefly, he lived in the second half of the 18th century. He was the middle of the 18th century. He was a Platonist. He was a Leibnizian. He defended Leibniz at the court in Berlin, where there was an attack led by the French against the influence of Leibniz. And it was Mendelssohn who was, as a great scholar, was the center of a mobilization, including his close friend, Gotthold Lessing. And Lessing wrote one of the great works in German, Nathan the Wise, which was about a Jewish philosopher, a wise Jewish man, modeled after Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn could never get an appointment to the Academy because he was Jewish, but he fought for the idea in the Jewish community that the Jews should learn German and that the Jews should fight for equality within Germany rather than staying in their little ghettos, staying in their poor conditions. And his personal figure was so prominent and so important that he single-handedly forced the court eventually to grant justice and freedom to the Jews of Prussia. And his work, well, just take a look at the Fidelio. I assume we have some in the office. If not, someone has copies and people can look at it. But he covered all areas, including music, including rewriting or reworking Plato's great dialogue on the immortality of the soul, the Phaedo, which he translated into German. But Mendelssohn's polemic to Jews was, we are all humans, and we have to function as humans, therefore we have to be integrated into the society. Now, he drew upon the tradition of Maimonides. There was a famous story about Maimonides, who was complaining to the Jewish community that it's wrong to be isolated and separated out. And he said there's an intrinsic validity to the world outside the Torah. And this came up around the debate over astronomy. Maimonides was an astronomer, because most, as you'll find, most great movements of ideas start by looking up at the heavens. And Maimonides found that the accepted view of the stars in the heavens that were in the works of the rabbis in the Talmud was wrong, because many of them said the stars don't move. There are sayings about be steadfast as the stars that don't move. God created the heavens and they were fixed. You know, these kinds of things. And Maimonides was arguing with the great scholars, and he said, but come out with me. Look at the sky. We don't have to. We're reading the great scholars who say that the stars are fixed. Classic case of a paradox. And so finally Maimonides got a few of them out there, and he said, but the Talmud is inspired by God, but that's the same God who made the heavens. And the heavens don't correspond to what's in your books. So there was a problem. And so they either could say the rest of the books were wrong, or they could ignore Maimonides. Instead, they named Maimonides a sage. And so he was another one of the rabbis whose writings were included in updated Talmudic commentaries. So that way they didn't have to throw out everything that went before. But what Maimonides said is there's intrinsic validity in the world outside our little community. And therefore one can be a loyal Jew, a committed Jew, and still live in the world outside the Jewish community. And this was what Mendelssohn picked up. And Mendelssohn had a tremendous influence in his time in bringing the works of Leibniz, of Plato, of great non-Jewish scholars into the Jewish community, which triggered a movement in Germany which was called the movement of the Maskilim, who were the teachers. It has the unfortunate name of the Jewish Enlightenment. Unfortunate because Enlightenment is not a good movement. The Enlightenment was basically Voltaire's attack on Leibniz. But the movement of the followers of Mendelssohn, they were called the Maskilim, the teachers. And they went throughout Eastern Europe to try to teach the Jews that you don't have to be isolated and little. Now there are two problems they had. One was the traditions. The tradition for centuries was you stick by the rules, you go by the 613 Jewish laws, and you stay away from the rest of the society except if you have to interact with them, like if there's a tax collector or there's someone you don't like who comes around. But the rest of the time you just stick to yourself. And so it was partly for self-protection from the outside world, but then it became protection to control the community from within. And so the Maskilim attacked this and said, we've got to get out of this kind of paranoia. Now, in Eastern Europe, I don't know if this will show up. Yeah, I guess it does. You get a sense here of some of the migrations. Now, well, this is the last Western migration, but before that, you had a fairly large Jewish community in this area here. And then it gradually moved in this way. And this area here, this is what was called the Pale of the Settlement, where mostly you have Russian, Eastern European Jews. Half of my family comes from this area. All of my wife's family comes from that area. I think Phil from Poland, a lot of Phil's family. But this was where the majority of the Jews in the world lived. Less so in Germany, but in Germany you had Jewish populations along the Rhine going back to 1000 AD. In fact, if you go to the city of Worms right now, which is not too far from Wiesbaden, they've just restored an old synagogue. There's a Jewish cemetery where there were people, you can see gravestones from about 1100, 1200. And in fact, in the city of Worms, you had a Jewish participation in the city in the 12th century, 11th and 12th century, where the Christian community revered the Jews. But then the pogroms, or the anti-Jewish activity, started around 13 and 1400 in that part in Germany. So you had these migrations, and I think there's actually a better slide of that. Well, this shows you the problem that existed in Poland. Now, one thing that's worth noting about Poland is that Poland, actually, the Jews were welcomed to Poland when they were kicked out of Spain and then had problems in France. They were welcomed in Poland, and there was a Renaissance in the, I think, the 14th century under Casimir, where you had Jewish scientists, Jewish scholars. But gradually, in the latter part of the 1700s, the Russian Empire extended itself first. This is the first partition, and you can see the Russian Empire here. The Ottoman Empire as far north as Poland. Yeah. The Habsburg Empire, and then Prussia. Now you see the Russian Empire moving, and finally, 1795, most of what was Poland was swallowed up in Russia. And Russia, in that period, was caught between a very backward grouping that Peter the Great didn't completely conquer, and a part that was committed to some kind of change but incapable of bringing it about. The Polish Revolution kept failing. Now this is the area which became known as the Pale of Jewish Settlement. This area here, more than 10% of the population that lived in this area, which was under Russia, more than 10% was Jewish, 10% of the population. Now, at this period of time, you had Mendelssohn and the beginning of the transformation of German Jewry. But what did you have in Russia? You had a different situation in Russia. And primarily, it was because of the backwardness of Russia. As Germany was beginning to develop, Russia still was a very backward society dominated by a peasantry, which was kept stupid and ignorant by the Russian Orthodox Church. This is in the late 19th century, just a picture of Russian peasants in their Sunday best hanging out in the square. These were the people that Peter the Great tried to transform. And you were saying this thing about cutting the beards. Well, 100 years later, they grew back. And the peasants in Russia were very backward and very easily stirred up against the Jews. Now, the change that occurred, and most of you know the story of the Hamiltonian economics, Friedrich List, Henry Carey, the development of real new economy in Germany beginning in the 1876 to 78 period, the development of in France and elsewhere of the use of the American system. And that came to Russia in the figure of Count Sergei Witte, who was in a sense, an advocate of Hamiltonian economics. He was the man who was responsible for developing the plan for the original Trans-Siberian Railroad, beginning in the 1890s, the late 1890s. He's the one who worked out financing from the Germans to build the first railroad, which led to the British going nuts and jumping in and breaking the German-Russian connection. And eventually, Witte in 1905, shortly after this picture, was overthrown because the Russians lost a war with Japan that was funded, the Japanese were funded by the British. As Russia started to sink, the situation, there was a brief constitution, and then the Tsar unleashed the pogroms. Unleashed the pogroms against the Jews, and this was in 1905. The country went to hell and really continued in that way. Pogrom means literally thunder, but it was when the Tsar's troops or anyone was given the go-ahead to go in and go into the Jewish community and beat the hell out of the population, burn down the synagogues. There were many of these, waves of them in the 1880s and then again after 1905, in which upwards of 1,000, sometimes 2,000 people would be killed. And it was this situation which led to the migrations, the great Jewish migrations to the United States. But it also led to something else. In this area in Russia, let me turn the lights back on. In this area of Russia, it wasn't really practical for people to learn Russian because you couldn't really appeal to the Russian population. It wasn't like Germany where you had a real classical culture. Remember, Germany was the Germany of Beethoven, of Schiller, of Mozart, of the Weimar classics. Germany was a highly urbanized country. And so the Jews who lived in the ghettos in Germany found, even though there was still some discrimination, the Jews were given more freedom. And in fact, in the 1840s in Germany, as a result of the Mendelssohnian Revolution, in cities like Worms, you had Jews on the city council. You had a Jewish mayor of Worms in 1864. And so this idea that Jews were always targets of Nazi-style oppression in Germany is a falsehood. It's a historical lie that was promoted mainly to convince Jews that wherever you are, you're always going to be oppressed. So you had several different movements that grew up in the Jewish community. One was a socialist movement, which basically said, and this was in Russia, which said, let's link up with the rest of the population and transform the country. But you had, growing underneath that, because of the pogroms, you had two other movements. One which said, let's move to the United States, and another one which said, we have to go to Israel. And it was that latter one, which I'm not going to talk about much tonight, except to just reference it. That's the one that was manipulated by the British to bring a large number of poor Jews into Palestine, which became the seedbed of the confrontation that exists to this day with the Jewish-Palestinian battle in the Middle East. But what's interesting is, if you were going to stay in Russia, what could you do? How could you change the Jews of Russia? And that's where we come to the leading characters of what I'm going to talk about, the Yiddish Renaissance. And the two who we're going to look at a little bit today are this one who is Abramovitz and this one who is Sholem Aleichem. Two people who are, as you'll see, they learned from Cervantes. Both of them loved and admired Cervantes, Schiller, Heine, and Shakespeare. These were the authors they admired. This is Sholem Aleichem in 1905, at the time that he was writing some of the works I'm going to just introduce you to briefly. Now, here's the problem they had. He had a scared population that lived the same way they had 500 years ago. They didn't have real jobs because they weren't allowed to have jobs for the most part in Russia. The Jews were only allowed to sell things to themselves, but they weren't allowed to produce anything. So they essentially, were just selling minimal services to each other. And so you had hunger, you had poverty. Eventually, some were allowed to do a little bit with farming, but you had created a character that Abramovitz wrote about called the Luftmensch. A Luftmensch means a man who lives on air. And according to now, Abramovitz created a character, Mendele the book peddler. In the same way you had Side Hamete Beningeli. Mendele didn't write, or Abramovitz didn't write in his own name, but he told stories. He had the book peddler who went from town to town, who would tell stories he'd heard about different problems facing Jews in other towns. But Mendele writes about the character called the Luftmensch. He said, well, once a Jew has broken himself of the vile passion of eating, food ceases to be a matter of importance to him, and he can spend the rest of his life requiring almost nothing. To this very day, in these modern times, many a Jew can be found who has only the vestige of a stomach, truly the size of an olive pit. And there are great hopes that with the passing of time, Jews will drift further and further away from eating, until among future generations there will be no trace left of the digestive tract at all, except for piles. Jews will then present a pretty picture to the eyes of the rest of the world. Whereas Sholem Aleichem once said, one of his characters said, if it wasn't for fasting on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I might have starved. Now you guys are going to have to get into this a little bit. Because what you've got to think about is, how do you take people who are fearful, who hold on to traditions that are backward? Traditions such as the matchmaking tradition. Traditions such as that there are only certain things you can eat, certain ways you can eat. Traditions that came over to this country. Traditions that still exist today. How do you deal with them? Well, you have to get people to laugh at their own folly. And that's what was done by Abramovitz and Sholem Aleichem. And I'm just going to introduce you briefly to two of the characters that they developed to help do this in the Jewish community. Now, in the case of Abramovitz, we already know that his stories were told by Mendele the book peddler. Now, one of the funny things about them, these characters, and the key character I want to introduce you to from Sholem Aleichem is a man named Tevye the milkman. Now, part of the idea of this Jewish tradition was that you memorized as much as you could of the Talmud, the Torah, and the Talmudic tradition is that you would sit around all day debating what one word meant in a passage in the Talmud. Now, you had some of that, didn't you, Phil? Yeah. It sometimes turns out brilliant lawyers, but mostly it turns out neurotic schnooks. Because most of it is, there's no content to it. It's an Aristotelian approach to knowledge. And so you find both Mendele and Tevye repeatedly quoting the good book and butchering the proverbs and the sayings to fit their immediate needs. You have the Tevye engaging in a constant dialogue with God. God, if you created so many poor, would it be such a crime to have one more rich man? God, as the good book says, well, why am I telling you what the good book says? You already know. But the idea of a character struggling day to day to survive and putting this in a story to poke fun of the people so they begin to see how silly they are holding on to these traditions and fears. Now there's one in particular that Mendele tells called The Brief Travels of Benjamin III. Now Benjamin III is also known as the Jewish Don Quixote, as you'll see in a moment. And the subtitle is being a description of his expeditions in which he reached the far mountains of darkness and saw and heard many a fine and wondrous marvel. hitherto related in all 70 of the world's tongues, and only now made available in our very own Yiddish. Now, what Abramovitz and Sholem Aleichem had to deal with is that people said, you can't write in Yiddish. If you write, you have to write in Hebrew. Of course, no one read Hebrew. No one spoke Hebrew. So what would be the point of writing in Hebrew? And if you didn't write in Yiddish, if you wrote these things in German, most Jews wouldn't understand them. Or Russian, most of them wouldn't understand them. So they said, how can we take a language which is mostly the mother tongue, the Mamaloshin, which is used to tell children to go to bed, to leave your father alone, to eat more. You don't like my cooking? That's the extent of the Yiddish language until Sholem Aleichem and Abramovitz took it over. And what did they do? They took this jargon and turned it into a language rich with irony. They took a population that's fearful and got them to laugh at their fears. They got people to read, and instead of just reading the Talmud and the Torah, they started reading these stories. And Sholem Aleichem himself used to travel all through that area of Russia and tell these tales on the stage. And he'd have thousands of people buy tickets to come hear him speak. When he later migrated to the United States, a similar thing happened in New York. And when he died in 1915, they say there were 150,000 people who lined the streets of New York to watch the funeral procession go by. So these guys transformed a population through developing language and the stories. Now I'm just going to give you a little bit of the story of Benjamin III. Now, Benjamin III lived in a town called Tunyadevka, which basically means the town of idlers, because no one ever did anything in this town. And so Mendele, in describing this, all of a sudden says, now how could this man who was a nobody suddenly is written up in the English and the German newspapers because of his travels? They marveled, a Jew, an unarmed Polish Jew on foot, with but a knapsack on his back and a prayer shawl bag beneath his arm, has ventured into the climes beyond the ken of the most famous British explorers. Only a Superman, they say, could have done it. Be that as it may, however, the world is indebted to him for his many prodigious discoveries, in consequence of which no atlas will ever be the same. Now, why is he called Benjamin III? Well, there was an initial Benjamin who was known as a traveler. Then there was Benjamin II of Poltsiceni, who died a while back in London while looking for the 10 lost tribes. Very interesting point, because this is an attack on British Israelites, the people in England who think the 10th tribe is the British royal family. But that's another story. So he says, now I, Mendele, having no other purpose than the advancement of my fellow Jews, insofar as I'm capable of it, could no longer refrain from vowing, if this man's story is known in every other language, isn't it time it's told in plain Yiddish? So let me tell you his story. Now he starts off saying, the small town of Tunyadevka is a God-forsaken place, far off the beaten track. So removed from the world indeed, that should a visitor appear in it, every door and window is opened at once, and all stare at him in amazement. Leaning into the street, the neighbors ask each other the 4 questions. Who is this fellow? Where out of the blue has he dropped from? What is he doing here? Can he have come for no reason at all? Why would he come here? And he says that pretty soon the whole town is buzzing, and it goes right into the synagogue, where people start asking the questions. And of course, in the synagogue, the real issues of the day are addressed. Family secrets, business deals, Turkish and Austrian politics, the wealth of the Rothschilds, the latest mail delivery, with news of recent pogroms or the discovery of a tribe of lost Jews, and so on and so forth. Well, here's an interesting irony in the synagogue. What are you supposed to do in the synagogue? You're supposed to pray, but they're talking and gossiping. Well, there's a story about that where, a Guy goes to the synagogue on Yom Kippur and he's poor. He has no money. But to pray in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, you have to pay. So the rabbi comes and the congregation president, and they say, what's the problem? And he says, I've got to pray, but I have no money. I've got to be here. It's the holiest day of the year. So the rabbi and the president confer for a moment, and then they come over and they say, we have a solution. And the rabbi says, you can come into the synagogue, but the president says, we'd better not catch you praying. Now this is the same tradition that they're making fun of. The religion doesn't exist as a relationship between man and God, but is part of this exclusion and gossip. Now he says a lot of things. There's a lot to say in this, but he's talking now about how poor the city is. And he says, but the inhabitants of Tunyadevka are content with what they have, and not choosy about their garments or their food. Let their Sabbath caftans be ripped or torn or less than immaculate or down at the seams. None of this matters as long as the satin still has a bit of shine. In fact, it can be as full of holes as a sieve, through which the wearer's skin shows. Since no one looks at such private parts anyway, why worry about them? They're no different from the bottom of a man's foot, which belongs to him too. And what Tunyadevkin would go around with his nose to the ground just to see whose shoes have soles on them? As for food, a bit of soup and bread, if it's available, is a meal. And if there's some challah and a soup bone on Friday night, why, a king could eat no better. Try mentioning anything fancier, and you'll get a strange and mirthful look as if you had told him that your cow flew over the roof and laid an egg. So you get the idea that it's poor. Now Benjamin, our hero, we come back to him. Benjamin's life in Tunyadevka lacked for nothing. True, he lived in extreme poverty, while his wife and children went about in tatters. But before the eating of the apple, did it occur to Adam and Eve to be ashamed of going naked? So you get the idea. Poor town, nothing's going on. And so this guy finally decides, what am I going to do with my life? And then he discovers travel books. Not quite chivalry books, but travel books. He's reading of the travels to the places, the praises of Jerusalem, the book called The Shadow of Eternity, which explained the 7 arts and in his many brief pages. These books opened his eyes and transformed him. I was tremendously excited, he has written. Now, where did he write this? You see the same kind of thing as Cervantes. You have a guy telling a story about someone who's already been written up in all the press and has written his own story. I was tremendously excited, he has written, by all these wonderful stories. Sometimes to the point of crying out loud, I, if only God would enable me to see 100th of this with my own eyes. My thoughts were carried far, far away. Now, the next chapter starts by saying, the problem is, by nature, Benjamin was a great coward. At night he was afraid to step out by himself, and all the money in the world could not have induced him to sleep alone in his own house. Little dogs made him quake with fear, and straying beyond the confines of Tunyadevka struck him as risking his life. So he had to try and change and vanquish his fears. So he would do nothing but read and try to walk to the edge of town. And eventually he became, his changed behavior, his preoccupied look, his new habit of disappearing at all hours were a puzzle to everyone, and soon made him the talk of the town. According to one theory, he was quite simply mad. In the first place, it has been said, he had been born a bit soft in the head. Secondly, there hadn't been a madman in Tunyadevka for years, and it was common knowledge that every town had its own idiot. And thirdly, even if he hadn't been crazy to begin with, the summer heat may have been making him so. So he plans to leave the town. And he's got 2 problems. One is, he doesn't know if he can get someone to go with him. And so he has to find a squire. Someone else who is scared of his wife. So he decides to leave the town, and he has another problem. He had no idea how to part from his wife. Should he take her into his confidence and reveal his plan? This could only lead to wild tears and the conviction that he had taken leave of his senses. How much, after all, could a Jewess from Tunyadevka understand? She might be a brave breadwinner, because of course the men didn't work, the women had to do the work, but she was still a woman. And there was less in the head of the canniest female than in the little finger of the most doltish man. Should he slip away without saying goodbye? There's an irony here. You'll get it in a minute. Don't hiss and boo. This struck him, should he slip away without saying goodbye, this struck him as disagreeable. The kind of thing that only a cold-blooded Lithuanian Talmudist might do. But what other choice was there? To sit at home for the rest of his life? That prospect was intolerable. He might as well lie down and die, since he and his journey were one. As other Jews turned toward Jerusalem in their prayers each day, so it was constantly before him. He even thought of it when he slept, for it was all he dreamed of at night, and his waking eyes and ears saw and heard not the world around him, but the exotic places that he yearned for. So finally he decides to leave, and he gets a new friend called Sendrel, and Sendrel knows nothing. The only thing he knows is that if he stays at home, his wife might kill him. And so he's up for the trip. And he thinks Benjamin is very scholarly because Benjamin can quote from all these books. Sendrel can only pray about Jerusalem, but Benjamin can describe it. And so he says, well, but Sendrel, I'll slip out of the house and wait for you by the deserted windmill. So you see constantly these references. Now, here's the problem. He leaves the house, and he's waiting for Sendrel. Will Sendrel show up or not? So he's waiting by the windmill. Just then, Benjamin spied a figure in the distance. Could it be he, Sendrel? But no. It was wearing a calico dress and had a kerchief on his head. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat, and he turned white as a sheet. For sure, it was his wife. The figure approached, or rather came toward him on the run as if to seize him by the collar and drag him yammering home. God alone knows, Benjamin has told his biographers, how at that moment I would have more gladly faced 100 fire-breathing dragons than my wife. For an angry dragon devours only the body, while an irate wife consumes body and soul. But God, in his great mercy, gave me courage, and I quickly hid behind the windmill and lurked there in the bush. Now, as the rest of the story goes, they set out on this tour. They go to another town. Actually, I have to just read you a description of this other town. They think they've really gone a long way, and they've actually gone the equivalent of about 2 miles. But they're trying to decide what language they'll speak when they meet people in the next town. And it's a Ukrainian town. It's not a Jewish town, so they're afraid because they say, gee, I don't think the Ukrainians speak Yiddish, do they? So he says, what do we do? And Sendrel says, well, you're an educated man and can look things up in your books. There's no doubt that you know what you're doing. That's why I haven't asked you if we're even heading in the right direction. So they get to this new town. Now, this is a town where the only 2 things that people did in this town, well, here's what it says. Teterevka, Benjamin relates, is inhabited by a large number of Jews. May they continue to be fruitful and multiply. But the problem is they have so little to do with each other that if one of them falls in the street, the others, strange to say, will refuse to help him up, even should his life depend on it. And he goes on and talks about the problems in this town. And they say, well, here's what they did in this town. They divide their days into waiting for breakfast, waiting for lunch, and waiting for supper. The 3 oases for which they long like a cow in barren fields for green pastures. It is commonly said that the very air of Teterevka makes a man sluggish and slothful. and that whoever arrives there with a bit of pluck or drive soon loses both, and wishes only to eat, sleep, and rise to eat more. During his stay, Benjamin met a number of provincial accountants and lawyers who had come to Teterevka from elsewhere. A man has to get out into the world, they had told the folk back home. He has to roll up his sleeves and apply himself and get ahead and do some good. In point of fact, being an accountant or a lawyer in Teterevka was like being a fifth wheel on a wagon, since the taxes remained just as high even without anyone's help. But so great was the ambition of these Teterevka-bound souls that they borrowed money to pay their bills and set out there full of hope. And so he did the same. He got to this town. There was just one problem, which was that whenever he came to the house of one of these learned gentlemen, the latter was either eating or sleeping. Once, however, he found one of them, a quite splendidly famous writer, reclining on a wooden bench in his study. "Good morning," said Benjamin. "And to you," replied the man. "What can I do for you?" "Oh," said Benjamin, "I just dropped by for a chat." But the chat went none too well. The writer looked comatose. His lips barely moved when he spoke. His eyelids kept drooping. And he seemed in all respects about to give up the ghost. Although Benjamin did his energetic best to keep the conversation going, he might have had better luck with a block of ice. In the end, the man roused himself, let out a mighty yawn, and called for his wife. "Tell me," he asked, "when are we going to eat? I hope it's soon, because I'd like to take a little snooze." In a word, Teterevka was one big bedroom in which everyone slept, and slept well. The scholars, the merchants, the banks, the courtrooms, the shops. There was no waking them from their slumbers. And even when the Teterevkans spent time in company, they sat staring at each other like so many mannequins until one by one they dozed off. The only thing that could breathe a spark of life into them was the dinner bell, which they responded to with great gusto before turning in for the night. So you get a sense this is an ongoing attack. Eventually what happens to Benjamin is he gets down the road about 3 miles total and can't find anyone who will give him money. He can't get any food. So he has to go back home where he's greeted as a hero. People ask him for his tales of his travels, and he basically says he almost got to the Holy Land before he had to turn back. And so the rest of his life he sits there telling his stories to people. Now, I assume there were many people like that in these towns. Now, Sholem Aleichem, you can't really do justice to him in 5 minutes, but I just want to tell you, the character Tevye is a brilliant, it's a brilliant series of stories. He wrote about 6 stories overall about this family, about every 8 years. And it's a story of what it's like to be a poor Jewish family in the shtetl, or the ghetto, at the time of great change in society, where Russia's undergoing the industrialization and the transformation, and the Jews are beginning to benefit from that a little bit, but they're still stuck in their hidebound traditions. And what is the element of change that comes in there? It's not the men, who either spend all their time studying, or if they work, they spend their time while they're working talking about their religion. It's through the women that change takes place. It's the Jewish mother, it's the Jewish daughter who challenge the tradition. And so one of the famous stories in Tevye is about his oldest daughter, who he goes out and arranges a marriage for her, and she says, "I don't want to marry him." He says, "Why not? He's rich." And she says, "I don't love him." And he says, "What does love have to do with it? I picked her out for you. This is a tradition." If any of you have ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, this is the Tevye stories. Now, I want to just take you back to one before this, where Tevye, being a typical Jew from that part of Russia, is hoping to get rich. He wants to be like a Rothschild. And so he gets a little bit of money, and he's trying to decide what to do with it. And then one day he's walking in town, and I see a real kissing cousin, let me tell you, the horse's own tail, as they say. Menachem Mendel was his name. A wheeler, a dealer, a schemer, a dreamer, a bag of hot air. No place on earth is bad enough to deserve him. He got hold of me and filled my head with such pipe dreams that it began to spin like a top. And so Menachem Mendel tells him a story. And so Tevye says, sit with me, Mr. Sholem Aleichem. Let me tell you what happened. So again, you have the same thing. Sholem Aleichem is being given the story by Tevye. So Tevye talks about Menachem Mendel and his schemes to get rich. He says, now, it's not all that easy, Tevye. One day you're up, the next you're down. The main thing is to keep breathing and to have faith. A Jew has to have hope. So what if things couldn't be worse? That's why there are Jews in the world. You know what they say, a soldier had better like the smell of gunpowder. Not that that has anything to do with it. All of life is but a dream. But tell me though, my good fellow, what are you doing here? So he's describing the situation where Menachem Mendel is a speculator, and the kind of Jewish speculator who is allowed to exist outside the official stock exchange to basically snooker the Jews who have a little bit of money to make more money for the people inside the stock exchange. But of course, Tevye doesn't know this. And so he said, he's listening to Menachem Mendel. Never in my life had I heard of such weird, complicated transactions. Stocks and shares, selling long, selling short, options and poptions, and the devil only knows what else. And the craziest sums, too. To tell you the truth, Menachem Mendel, I said, you must have a marvelous head on your shoulders to figure all that out. There's only one thing I don't get, though. If I know your wife, as I think I do, how does she let you run around loose like this without coming after you on a broomstick? And he says, I wish you hadn't mentioned that. She runs hot and cold, she does, mostly freezing. And of course, this is because this guy has gambled away every penny the family has. But it's her wife. And he says, if I were to read you some of the letters she writes me, you'd see what a saint I am. But that's neither here nor there. What's a wife for, if not to put a man in his place? Believe me, some of you guys don't get this, huh? Believe me, I have a worse problem than her, and that's my mother-in-law. I don't have to describe her to you, though. You know her well enough. So he says, in a word, we stayed up gabbing half the night. By then I was dizzy from all his wild stories about the thousands of rubles he had juggled as though he were Brodsky. Well, Brodsky was the local rich Jew. All night long my head was in a whirl. Yehupetz, which is the big city. Gold Imperials, Brodsky, Menachem Mendel and his mother-in-law. It wasn't until the next morning, though, that he finally got to the point. What was the point? It was, said Menachem Mendel, that since money was so scarce in Yehupetz, that you couldn't even give away your goods. You, Tevye, you have a chance not only to make a nice killing, but also to help save my life. So for the next thing you know, he gets talked into it and he gives his money to Menachem Mendel. And Menachem Mendel says, just wait for a few days for them to go up. And then you send off a telegram with an order to sell and you buy twice as much. Then you wait a few more days and send a telegram again. Before you know it, your 100's worth 2, your 204, your 408, your 800, 1,006. It's the damnedest thing. Well, so as to not make a short story long, he gave me such an itch to be rich that it wasn't a laughing matter. Why look a gift horse in the mouth, I told myself. Maybe he's really meant to be your good angel. Now, of course, what happens is he invests the money and loses it all. And so he eventually sees Menachem Mendel again. He couldn't find him after he lost his money, and he said, well, who did I see but in it Mr. Moneybags himself? My heart sank to my stomach. I thought I would die. We should only live to meet our worst enemies crawling down the street like Menachem Mendel. You should have seen his coat and his shoes and the face on him. Why, a corpse in the grave looks better. Nu, Tevye, I thought, you're up the creek this time for sure. You can kiss every cent you ever had goodbye. The principal's gone with the profit, and all that's left you is the troubles. And that's what happened. But when Menachem Mendel tells him his story, Tevye, being good-hearted, says, it's okay, it's only money. And so he ends by this story by saying, and that, Sholem Aleichem, is how I blew all my money. But if you think I've been eating my heart out over it, you have another guest coming. You know the Bible's opinion. Money is a lot of baloney. What matters is the man who has it. I mean, what matters is for a man to be a man. You know what I still can't get over, though? Losing my dream. If only you knew how badly, O Lord, how badly I wanted to be a rich Jew. If only for just a few days. But go be smarter than life. Doesn't it say in the good book, nobody asks if you want to be born or if you want your last pair of boots to be torn? Instead of dreaming, Tevye, God was telling me, you should have stuck to your cheese and butter. Does that mean I've lost faith and have stopped hoping for better times? Don't you believe it. The more troubles, the more faith. The bigger the beggar, the greater his hopes. How can that be, you ask? But I've already gone on enough for one day, and I better be off about my business. How does that verse go? There isn't a man who hasn't taken a beating sometime. Don't forget to take care and be well. And so there are a series of stories, and what you see is the development in Tevye of someone from an ignorant cheese and butter salesman to someone who actually begins to get a view of the world. And eventually, what does Tevye do? He does what Sholem Aleichem did, and what most of the Jews, or a lot of the Jews of Russia did. He moved to North America. Between, 1881 and actually about 1900, 68% of the Jews who moved from Russia moved to North America, or to the United States, 2.56 million. And most of that occurred in the period between 1888 and 1914. Some moved to Canada, some to other countries in Latin America. Argentina, 218,000 Eastern European Jews. And then South Africa had a lot of migration. Now, the one thing that the Eastern European Jews brought with them was a love of reading. This is a photo taken from a ship on the way to the United States. And what you see is that all of them have books. They're all reading. The first thing a lot of the Jewish women did when they came to the United States is they got library cards. They found out about libraries in the United States and went out and got library cards, took their children to school to get educations. Now, the important thing about the Yiddish Renaissance is that what you had was a population of people who were poor and ignorant, who were in the worst circumstances, but who came to laugh at themselves, stopped taking their troubles so seriously, and realized that they probably could actually do something about their troubles. And it was through Sholem Aleichem and Abramovitz in particular, the two who were the most important, who got people to have this sense of irony, this sense of humor about their circumstances, and a sense that we can overcome these problems. Now, many of the Jews from Eastern Europe, when they came to the United States, immediately got involved in the trade union movement. Many of them, their children, were the Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement. And Lynn has written about this. These are the Jewish people he knew during his professional years in New York City, with a sense of hope, a sense of aspirations for the better, which came out of this. Now, the other part of this is that it wasn't just the Yiddish classics, but they started translating all the great works of literature into Yiddish. And at one time in New York City, you had 2 Shakespeare companies that presented Shakespeare in Yiddish. That had, my mother said her mother used to go see King Lear, Hamlet, The Merchant of Venice, in Yiddish. You had a number of Jewish singers who became opera stars. The cantor, the singer at my mother's synagogue was Richard Tucker, who was one of the great American tenors in the 1950s and 60s. Now, the tragedy is that the great bulk of the people who spoke Yiddish were killed in the Holocaust. And I can't find, Lynn wrote a beautiful tribute. I'll find it sometime later and get it to you, but a beautiful tribute to those victims, because he said this was the educated Jewry that had come through the tradition of Moses Mendelssohn through the Yiddish Renaissance. And that to the extent that the Zionist tradition, which says that to be a Jew is to be a victim, this Zionist ADL view today, which says we were victimized, we were the victims of the Holocaust, and no one else can say they had a Holocaust. The only real Holocaust was the Jewish Holocaust. And we've been oppressed for 4,000 years. That view is the view which creates the crazy lunatics that today say that Israel belongs to them alone. The Palestinians have no right to be there. And so this great Renaissance at the turn of the 20th century was a victim of three things. One, its success, because the success of the Yiddish Renaissance was that Jews became people who could assimilate into society in the United States, where they were given that opportunity. Secondly, the tragedy of the Jews who were killed during World War II. And third, the other Jews who gave up Yiddish and created a totally new language, Hebrew, in Israel, and turned Israel, or tried to turn Israel, into a country which is essentially a cult based on worship of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was done to us, therefore we can do whatever we want to the Arabs and Palestinians. And so this Renaissance has been lost completely. In a period of less than 100 years, it's gone. Very few people read Yiddish today. Very few people know of these stories. But I would encourage you to get somebody, one of you should get a copy of this book, which is one of the few books available by Sholem Aleichem, and read through the Tevye stories. And you'll get a sense of how it is, what kind of humor is necessary to lift people up, to shake them up, and get them to be willing to change themselves and to start acting on the stage of history as opposed to thinking that they're just little people who are always going to be victims. So I hope that this little vignette gives you a sense of this history, which is, to most of the world, has been lost. So, we'll take some questions. So, you can ask questions if you have more questions for Madi, or you can ask. Is that on time?
Actually, Harley, you can still today, several times a year, you can get to Yiddish language immersion classes in New York.
Well, this is something new. They just started resurrecting it, but it's not the real stuff. It's really bad cult stuff. Mm-hmm. There's also klezmer music, which is the rotten music. It's the mariachi music of Jews. That's another thing that you see these klezmer bands. If you in Los Angeles, this is what they're doing.
Harley, I have a question about Ben Gurion.
Yeah.
That he was a Zionist in the sense that he supported the creation of Israel. So there's two different kinds of Zionism, or is?
Well, yes. I mean, basically, yes. I mean, here's the problem you have, and this is a much longer, more involved topic. I've written a couple of long book reviews in the EIR on this. That if people are interested in following up, let me know, and I'll get them for you to look at. But what do? See, you had the British created the Zionist movement. It was largely created by a low-level play critic, drama critic, named Theodore Herzl, who was a nobody. And he got picked up by Lord Rothschild because the British knew that the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. And the British, in the whole 19th century, propped up Turkey. But when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, what was going to happen in this part of the world that was controlled by the Ottomans? So the British came up with a plan, which was to utilize something called the British Israelite view within the British elite. Because a section of the British elite, including the British royal family, believe that they're descended from the lost tribe. In fact, they think they're descended from Jesus Christ and King David. The Order of the Priory of Zion, which is one of the highest secret orders inside the British royal establishment. And one of their people was David Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister during World War I, who was the attorney for Herzl. And so a group of the elite in England said, how about this for a plan? Let's take a bunch of Jews and put them back in the Middle East, and then we can become their defenders, so that after the Turks go, we can control the Arabian Peninsula through the operations we're doing in the Arab world, and we can divide this area up between Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, and they'll fight each other and we can have access to it. That was the plan. And most Jews didn't want to go. You know, as Lynn once said in a slightly less poetic way, he said, if a Jew wanted sand up the crack of his butt, he'd go to Miami, not to the beaches of Israel. Very few Jews had the idea of Benjamin III. In fact, you see in Abramovitz, the idea of going to the Holy Land, for a Russian, that's nuts. You even go outside of your city limits and you get lost. If you want to go somewhere, go to America where there's freedom. So what happened is, in 1917, you had this thing called the Balfour Declaration, where Lord Balfour, who was the foreign secretary at the time, promised the Jews in writing, you will have a homeland. Now again, that didn't mean a whole
Wait,
lot.
that was 1870?
No, 1917. Yeah. It was never intended. But what happened is, after the Holocaust and World War II, where most of the world had not just turned their backs on the Jews who were killed, but virtually everyone was being killed by the Nazis. In fact, the British and the Bush family and the Harrimans helped put the Nazis in power. But after the war, what do you do with the million Jews who were survivors? Meanwhile, you had a group of people like Ben-Gurion and others who had a different idea. Ben-Gurion was anti-British. Ben-Gurion said, how about having a Jewish state and a Palestinian state that work together? If we're going to have an idea of Zionism, how about an idea of Zionism as an anti-colonial movement? And this is something we wrote up, Steve Meyer and I did an article in the EIR. This is the tradition that Rabin comes out of. The idea that Jews should have a right to a land in Israel. Now, I would argue that there's no inherent right there. The UN probably made a mistake when in 1947-48, when they made the decision to establish the State of Israel. But once it was established and once it's there, then it should be a constitutional nation state that can work with its neighbors. There's no reason why you can't have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And this is what Lynn's work was based on in the 80s. That was then adopted by Peretz and eventually by Rabin with the Oslo Accord. So if you want to say, is there a good Zionism and a bad Zionism? I mean, essentially the problem you had is, what do you do with the million Jews who survived at the end of World War II, most of whom couldn't get into the United States. They couldn't get into Canada, and they didn't want to stay in Europe. So most of them went to Israel. And after the Jewish state was created, the question was, would it be a state with a constitution? Would it be a state that would be a nation, a republic, that could live and work with its Arab neighbors or not? Now, part of this is the failure of the Arab world. And part of it's the failure of the Israeli, the Jews who wanted to do what was right. But the real problem rests from the outside. It's the British. The British did this. They did it to the Jews and to the Palestinians. And the British are continuing to do it. And now you've got this crazy faction in the United States of ultra right-wing Zionists who say we ought to exterminate the Palestinians. That's this guy, Rabbi Kahana, who was assassinated a few years ago but still has his movement in Israel. It's these rotten little kids from Brooklyn who go over and get a gun in their hand and start shooting Palestinian children. And this goes against the actual Mendelssohnian tradition, which is what most of the European Jews brought with them to Israel. And so you've got the makings of World War III in the contradictions within the Yiddish Renaissance. Now, none of these are inherent in Judaism, although you can see that for 1,000 years, these kind of nutty traditions dominated the culture. So we're still, this is the fight that we're waging. Ben-Gurion was not perfect. He was a well-educated guy, and he's actually someone who had a number of very good qualities. Most important was this idea of an anti-colonial, anti-British movement. And one of the people he was working with was the grandfather of the current king of Jordan, who used to secretly come into Jerusalem. I mean, actually, Jordan was running Jerusalem then. He used to secretly go into the Jewish sector on the edge of Jerusalem and meet with Ben-Gurion to try and figure out how to settle this thing. And he was assassinated. So the whole situation. Yeah. And his son was the person who became King Hussein, who just died last year. Yeah.
You had mentioned that a lot of the people who died in the Holocaust came from this Yiddish Renaissance, or?
Well, they were the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews who adopted the Yiddish Renaissance. They spoke Yiddish. They read these stories. This was their world outlook.
Okay. Well, because, I mean, it seems like, you know, from what I'm learning, like, every time there's a good thing, you know, in human history, the oligarchs rush in there to break
Absolutely.
it up. So do you believe that, like, the Holocaust was intentional or just like a coincidence?
I was absolutely intentional, but it wasn't just directed at Jews. It was also directed at Christians. It was directed at human beings. Hitler hated Christianity. The reason he hated the Jews is that Christianity came out of Judaism. But Hitler wasn't the one calling the shots. The people who really hated the Jews were people like the Harrimans, the Bush family, these networks. The anti-Semite, the typical Nazi brown shirt anti-Semite, it's like the typical Klansman in East Texas. Guys, not even most of the time you don't know how he's smart enough to put the hood over his head. You can deal with this kind of racism. You can deal with the Nazis, the people who became the brown shirts. If you had people who were running the country who were good, they'd educate them and they'd be okay. The problem is the institutional connections, the old oligarchy. Backing Hitler was the British financial elite and the old oligarchy of South Germany, the Wittelsbach family, the Thurn and Taxis family, which goes back to the Roman Empire. These are the people who promoted this. They promote the cults. These are the people who promoted Wagner, who was a racist pig. These are the people who promote these anti-human ideologies. Wagner is anti-Jewish, but he's also anti-Christian. He goes back to the pre-Christian myths. And so you're absolutely right. What Lynn wrote in this piece, and I'll find it, I'll show it to you later. He said this was an anti-human movement that stamped this out precisely because of their commitment to oligarchical rule. Yeah. Because the themes, look, these themes are the same themes Cervantes took up, the same themes Dante took up. They were Republicans. They believed in the dignity of the common human being. They believed if the masculine, if you educate people, they'll get out of their poverty. They'll stop acting like animals at a trough and will recognize they're human. And then you can have advance in society. Now, if you're an oligarch, you don't want that. You want people stupid. You want human cattle. And so you target the people who might actually be the ones who could be part of a movement to get out of that. That's why they hate Lynn. Because Lynn isn't just a smart guy. Lynn is a guy who knows how to track them. That's what scares him about Lynn. He has the smell of this stuff. As he said, you get the spoor of the operation like a hunter. Once you get that, you go after it. And they're terrified because they can run all kinds of bogus cover stories, and Lynn says, I know what that is. That's the same old Aristotelian bullshit. You can't fool me. And that's what they don't like. Guess we have time for one more. Anyone else? You got to see, to be a strategic thinker, you've got, as Lynn was saying, you've got to know history. You've got to know cultures. You've got to understand this process of discovery so that you can't be fooled. Now, how many of you, in the back of your mind, are still thinking, well, isn't it possible it was Osama bin Laden? I mean, isn't it really possible that they did train a couple of these guys to fly planes and they were able to sneak their way in and pull this thing off? I mean, isn't Lynn exaggerating? Any of you think that at all? Well, I bet when you go out and start organizing and people start saying that vehemently, the doubt comes up. So how do you know that you're right? To do what we have to do, you've got to actually understand history. I mean, what Lynn said today about Afghanistan. No one's conquered Afghanistan since Alexander the Great. Do you think General Hugh Shelton, the admirer of the KKK, and Jefferson Davis, can hold a candle to Alexander the Great? Do you think the people you know who are in the military, you think they're going to be able to fight in the jungle, in the deserts, in the caves? As soon as they get over there, they're going to want a Jack-in-the-Box hamburger or something. Where's my rock and roll? You know, we're a nation that if you don't have a mission and you're a mercenary soldier and you're fighting against people who know a terrain, you're a sitting duck for it. So what are we going to do? Just lob bombs in there? What are you going to bomb Afghanistan back to the Stone Age? You're too late. So you've got to know the history. You know the culture. You know the battle of ideas. Know Cervantes. Make Cervantes your friend. Make Schiller your friend. Make Shakespeare your friend. Shakespeare knew the mentality of these guys. Just read Richard III. It's not just Richard III, it's every single character in that play. Anne Neville, who was married to someone that Richard had just murdered. And while she's standing there mourning over the still warm corpse, Richard comes up to her and says, if you want to be a player, you got to marry me. And she ends up marrying him, even though she knows he'll kill him as soon as he has a chance. Why did she do it? Because of the corruption. Shakespeare knows this mind. So you read Shakespeare, you read Schiller, you read Cervantes, you get this. That's what Lynn has done. Second, I just found this thing that Lynn wrote because it's highly relevant for what we got earlier today. This was called Music, Judaism, and Hitler, and it was written, I don't have the date on here, but he said, the greatest contributions of the Jew to European civilization was the movement generated by the work of one of the greatest individual geniuses of modern extended European civilization, Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was not merely a Jew who contributed to modern civilization. He was a leading, integral part of the late 18th century revolution, without which there would have been no modern European science, no modern classical music or other artistic composition, and without which freedom and the federal constitution would not have been possible. And after this was written, Lynn discovered the role of Kessner, and he probably would say there wouldn't have been a Gauss or Riemann or these breakthroughs because of the relationship there. Not only did Moses Mendelssohn as a German play a leading role in creating modern Germany and modern European civilization in the 18th century onward, as a German of Orthodox Jewish faith, he, like Martin Luther King in our own time, freed the Jew by freeing the German to become part of an ecumenical system of justice under the supreme rule of nothing but reason itself. In that process, he mobilized from among German Jews, and by implication, the Yiddish Renaissance of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, to make a contribution to modern civilization way beyond all proportion to their relative numbers among the populations within which they lived as a part. Thus, that German Jew, complemented by the forces of the Yiddish Renaissance, is an expression of the soul of the Jew. In the simultaneity of eternity, the Yiddish Renaissance of Germany and Eastern Europe bequeathed to posterity great gifts to which posterity must turn fond attention whenever the name of Jew is spoken. With that, every Christian bearing the legacy of Augustine must concur. To deny the Jews hated by Hitler their claim to that honor is to subject those who suffered to a virtual second Holocaust, a Holocaust of deadly silence, a virtual denial that those millions of victims ever existed, except as a mass of nameless dead. This was, Lynn wrote this in part in response to this absolutely ugly, brutal architecture that was put up in Germany as a Holocaust remembrance. It's basically about, I think it's about 12-story high, just slabs of concrete, about 10 of them, in the center of Berlin, which supposedly is a commemoration of the Jews who died in the Holocaust. And Lynn was saying that to just turn the Jews into victims of the Holocaust in that way is to exterminate that which was universal in the Yiddish Renaissance, which is, as Madi was saying, what these few writers did with Yiddish was create a universal language with an ability to express great ideas out of nothing over a period of just a few years. And that contributed to the 20th century, and in the case of Mendelssohn, to the 19th century. So that, I just wanted to get that to you.
What time did Sholem Aleichem and
Abramovich was writing from the 1860s to about 1900, and Sholem Aleichem from the 1870s to 1915.
Yeah, you probably might be done in another hour.
Under 25, you've got a 10-year head start in learning Greek, Chinese, whatever language you wish to take up. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is something called the Yiddish Renaissance. And it's a little bit different from the great golden Renaissance of the 15th century in Europe. In some ways, and in other ways it was characteristic of that kind of movement. But it's different because it was among people who were not a nation. It's the Jewish people. And part of the fight, which is the fight that, when I told you earlier what Lynn had to say about the Zionist nuts, kick the Zionists in their nuts, that what you have with Zionism, in a sense, is an attempt, an artificial attempt, to create the idea of a nation out of a religion. And that what you'll see from the people I'll be discussing is that their idea of religion was that one could be a patriot of Germany and still a Jew, a Russian national and still a Jew, that you were not a Jew, meaning you were an Israelite. And the fight of the Yiddish Renaissance was to take the Jewish people, who were spread primarily over Poland, Ukraine, Russia, who were poor, who were oppressed, and then who engaged in a self-oppression, to lift them up so they could actually become citizens of nations. Now, I had some personal experience with this growing up in West Virginia. Not one of the more enlightened parts of the world. It was enlightened in the Civil War because it broke from Virginia over the issue of slavery, but it didn't grow since that time. And I went to a school in a poor area in Morgantown, West Virginia. And one time I had my brothers and I used to walk to school with these two guys who lived next door to us, Greasy Powell and his brother Paul Powell. His father actually named him Greasy. And their cousins were Snooky and Odell Goodwin. We were walking home one day, and Greasy Powell said to me, "What nationality are you?" And I said, "I'm an American." This is when I was in 5th grade. And he said, "You're not an American." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "No, you're not. You're Jewish." And I said, "Well, let me explain something." I said, "What religion are you?" And he said, "I'm a Baptist." And I said, "And what nationality are you?" He said, "I'm an American." And I said, "Well, you're a Baptist American, and I'm a Jewish American." And he said, "No, you're not an American because you're Jewish." And to punctuate the point, he jumped me and started hitting me. Fortunately, I had two brothers who jumped to my defense, and we had a nice brawl. And even though it was 4-on-3, we won the fight. And I said, "Now you see, don't mess with Jewish Americans." So we didn't, who needed the ADL? Now, to get a sense, and I'm going to go through some of this ability for a nation, but how many people do that in this country? What is it? Americans think, well, we've got so many people, who am I? I'm just one person. Well, in fact, you'll find that movements that transform history start from one person, as in the case of Cervantes, one person who many times realizes that what they do will not be recognized in their time. Or they may get a certain amount of popular acclaim in their time, but it may be centuries later that people actually grasp the implications of what they were doing. As in the case of Cervantes, unfortunately, Spain continued to degenerate. There was not a rebirth in Spain, but Cervantes personally helped create other nations. And one of the figures who is a relatively important figure in the 20th century, who read Cervantes every year in Spanish, was the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who is a product of the Renaissance. You want to know how to spell it? Is that what you're saying, Mike? I had to interpret your gestures there.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah. David Ben-Gurion, who is a product of the movement that I'm going to be discussing in a moment, did two things every year. He read Cervantes in Spanish, and he read Plato in Greek. He studied Greek at the age of 35, so he could learn Greek, so he could read Plato in Greek. So all of you who are... All right, so I'm going to go through an example of another Renaissance, because in a sense, what Cervantes did was initiate a Renaissance in Spain to bring the ideas of the Italian Renaissance, the revival of Plato and the classical Greek culture, to Spain in the same way that this had been done in Italy, starting with Petrarch and Dante, and also Erasmus was a figure in the Northern European Renaissance. We're going to be talking about a Renaissance that's not that far away from most of your lives, but one that's very little known. Now, I want to make a point at the beginning that I think Madavilia will find quite interesting, because I don't think she was fully aware of this before. But Cervantes played a major role in the Renaissance I'm going to be discussing. But it was largely through Germany and Russia that the people I'm going to be discussing came into familiarity with Cervantes, because Pushkin was a great admirer of Cervantes, the great Russian poet and playwright. And also Heine and a number of German poets were great admirers of Cervantes. Now, a Renaissance is a revival of great classical ideas. That's the best way of looking at what a Renaissance is. The rebirth of the great classical ideas. And the purpose of literature, drama, painting, sculpture, those art forms we associate with the Renaissance, is to transform the notion of man that exists in the time where the artists are engaging in their activity. That is, why do you need a Renaissance? I mean, why do we need a Renaissance today? The conception of man that most people have today, the way Lynn discussed it today, is a degraded conception of man. That we're out for our own pleasures, our own survival, our own security. We need to make money. We've got to have a house. We've got to make sure that we can have pleasure and fun. The popular culture is filled with that kind of conception of what it is to be man. You know, to get your pleasure, to make sure that, you know, maybe you do some good things in your life, but you still take care of number one. Now that's why you need a Renaissance, because if you take that kind of thinking in a population, people who think that way will tolerate the genocide that's occurring in Africa. And we heard very beautiful statements today from two people who are here, in a sense, representing nations, from Uganda and then Crystal from Cameroon, who are here asking, what can I do to save my nation? And that's the mentality of someone who actually takes responsibility